Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we are going to walk slowly into one of the oldest worlds ever told. The world of Greek heroes, where mountains still remembered the footsteps of gods, where prophecies traveled faster than ships, and where a single child, set adrift in a wooden chest, could carry the weight of a kingdom's future on his small chest. Settle in. Let the lights grow low. Pull the blanket close, and let the room around you soften into shadow. There is no need to follow every name. No need to remember every island or every king. The story will carry itself, the way a slow current carries a boat, and you are welcome to drift along with it, or to let your eyes close at any moment and let the words become part of your dreams. We will travel tonight through bronze chambers and salt-bleached harbors, through orchards at the edge of the world, and palaces built on cliffs above the sea. We will meet a boy who is washed ashore on a quiet island, a young man who walks into the lair of a sleeping monster, a hero who labors through 12 long years to wash the blood from his own hands, a prince who finds his way out of a stone maze by following a thread, and many others whose names have been spoken softly in firelight for nearly 3,000 years. This is the age of heroes, a long, slow age lit by lamps and by the moon, where the divine still walked close to the earth, and where the line between mortal and God was thin enough to step across. It is a long story, and a gentle one in the telling, even when the deeds within it are great. So let us begin where it always begins. Not with a battle, not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet room beneath the earth, in a kingdom that had grown frightened of its own future. Chapter 1, The Tower of Bronze. The first of the great heroes was not born in a palace of light, but in a quiet room beneath the earth, in a kingdom that had grown frightened of its own future. Long before Perseus opened his eyes upon the world, his grandfather, King Acrisius of Argos, had traveled to the oracle at Delphi to ask the question that troubled him most. He had no son. He had only a daughter, Danae, gentle and quick of step, with hair the color of pale wheat. He wished to know who would inherit the throne after him, and whether the gods would, in time, send him an heir of his own blood. The answer he received did not comfort him. The oracle spoke briefly, almost without expression, and her words followed him home through every mile of the long road back to Argos. The prophecy was simple. He would have no son of his own, but his daughter would bear a child, and that child, when grown, would one day be the cause of his death. Acrisius rode home in silence, with the words turning over and over in his mind. By the time he saw the walls of Argos rising above the plain, he had already begun to plan what he would do. He could not bring himself to kill the daughter he loved. To shed the blood of his own child would invite a curse no king could survive. But he could keep her from the world, and so keep the prophecy from waking. Beneath the floor of his palace, in a part of the foundations untouched by sunlight, he ordered a chamber to be built. The walls were lined with bronze. The door was bronze. The ceiling was bronze, fitted carefully so that no crack would let the open sky in. Into this chamber he placed Danae. She was given soft cloth for her bed, lamps that were tended by a single old woman, and a small grate above her head through which a little air could pass. She was given food and water and gentle hands to brush her hair. She was given everything except the world. The door closed behind her with a sound like a coin dropped into a deep well, and after that, the days inside the bronze room moved slowly, lit only by the small flames her keeper carried down each morning. But the gods see through stone, and they do not respect the locks of fearful men. High on Olympus, Zeus turned his gaze toward the bronze chamber beneath the palace at Argos. and he saw the young woman sitting alone with her hair loose around her shoulders. He saw her sing softly into the empty air. He saw the way the lamplight moved across her hands, and he came to her, not as a man, not as a storm, but as a quiet shower of golden rain that drifted down through the small grate above her bed, settling on her skin like warm light on water. In the months that followed, Danae began to change. The old woman who tended her noticed it first and said nothing. Then the keeper of the door noticed and was afraid. At last, in the depth of one winter, a small cry rose from the bronze chamber, thin as a thread, and the news could no longer be hidden. Danae had borne a child, a boy. She named him Perseus and held him close in the lamplight, while the bronze walls listened. When the news reached Acrisius, he did not believe it at first. He went down himself, with a torch in his hand, and stood in the doorway of the chamber, and saw his daughter sitting on the bed with the infant at her breast. The boy looked up at him with eyes that were already alert, already steady. Acrisius did not enter the room. He turned and climbed the stairs in silence, and that night he could not sleep. He thought of the oracle. He thought of the bronze. He thought of how the sky itself had reached down to mock his careful walls. He could not strike the child openly. To kill an infant in his own palace would mark him forever. But the sea was vast, and the sea had no memory. He summoned his most trusted men and ordered a great wooden chest to be built, large enough for a young woman and her child, sealed tightly against the waves. When it was ready, he had Danae brought up from the bronze chamber for the first time in over a year. She blinked at the sky like someone newly born. She held Perseus in her arms and did not weep, even when she saw the chest waiting on the shore. The men set the chest into the water at twilight, when the harbor was empty and no one would see. They pushed it out past the rocks into the open sea and turned their backs and walked home. Inside, Danae sat with her son in the soft dark and listened to the sound of the waves against the wood. The chest rocked and rose and fell and rose again. Perseus did not cry. He slept against her chest with the steady breath of a child who had not yet learned that the world was dangerous. The chest drifted for many nights. The sea carried it past islands the gods had set down at the beginning of the world, past the lights of small fishing villages, past schools of fish that turned in shining circles beneath it. Dana spoke to her son in whispers. She sang to him the songs her mother had once sung to her, songs about almond trees in spring and about the long roads to the temple. She slept lightly, with her arm around him, and woke each time the chest tilted in the waves. At last, on a quiet morning when the sea had grown calm, the chest came to rest against the shore of a small island called Seriphos. A fisherman named Dictys was drawing in his nets when he saw the strange wooden shape rocking in the shallows. He waded out and pulled it onto the sand, and when he opened the lid, he stepped back in surprise. A young woman lay inside, pale and weary, with a child sleeping in her arms. She looked up at him, and he saw that she was not afraid. He set down his net. He helped her to her feet. He carried the child himself, gently, as if he had always known how, and led them both up the path toward his small house above the harbor. Dictys was a kind man, and a poor one. He had no wife, no children, only a brother named Polydectes who ruled the island with a colder hand. Dictys did not bring Danae to his brother's hall. He brought her instead to his own quiet home, with its low roof and its single hearth, and there he gave her a place to rest. He asked no questions. He listened only when she wished to speak. He set out a small bowl of milk for the child, and watched as Perseus drank, and saw in the boy's eyes something that did not belong to ordinary children. The years passed slowly on Seriphos. Perseus grew tall. He He learned to mend nets, to climb the rocks above the harbor, to read the weather in the color of the sea. He learned the names of the stars from the old fishermen who gathered in the evenings around the smell of salt and wood smoke. His mother taught him the songs of Argos, though she did not tell him why she had left. Dictys taught him to be patient and quiet and watchful. By the time Perseus reached the edge of manhood, he carried himself with the ease of someone who had been raised by the sea, and the steadiness of someone who had been loved. But on the high ground above the harbor, in a colder hall, Polydectes had been watching too. He had seen Danae many times over the years, and her beauty had not faded. He had seen her son grow strong, and he had begun to think of both of them not as people, but as obstacles. The bronze chamber was far behind them now. The chest was long since broken up for firewood. And yet the prophecy that had carried Perseus across the sea was not yet finished. It had only been waiting, patient as the tide, for the boy to grow into the man who could fulfill it. That night, on the small island where the lamps of the fishermen glowed along the shore, Perseus stood at the door of the house and looked out across the dark water. He did not know what was coming. He only knew that the sea, which had once carried him here, was beginning to whisper again. Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we are going to walk slowly into one of the oldest worlds ever told, the world of Greek heroes, where mountains still remembered the footsteps of gods, where prophecies traveled faster than ships, and where a single child, set adrift in a wooden chest, could carry the weight of a kingdom's future on his small chest. Settle in. Let the lights grow low. Pull the blanket close, and let the room around you soften into shadow. There is no need to follow every name, no need to remember every island or every king. The story will carry itself, the way a slow current carries a boat, and you are welcome to drift along with it, or to let your eyes close at any moment and let the words become part of your dreams. We will travel tonight through bronze chambers and salt-bleached harbors, through orchards at the edge of the world, and palaces built on cliffs above the sea. We will meet a boy who is washed ashore on a quiet island, a young man who walks into the lair of a sleeping monster, a hero who labors through 12 long years to wash the blood from his own hands, a prince who finds his way out of a stone maze by following a thread, and many others whose names have been spoken softly in firelight for nearly 3,000 years. This is the age of heroes, a long, slow age lit by lamps and by the moon, where the divine still walked close to the earth, and where the line between mortal and God was thin enough to step across. It is a long story, and a gentle one in the telling, even when the deeds within it are great. So let us begin where it always begins, not with a battle, not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet room beneath the earth, in a kingdom that had grown frightened of its own future. Chapter 2, The Gorgon's Head. The boy who had once slept in a wooden chest was now a young man, and the island that had taken him in was no longer a place where he could remain unseen. Polydectes had waited a long time. Year after year he had watched Danae from the height of his hall, and year after year she had refused him. She did not raise her voice. She did not insult him. She simply turned her face away whenever his messengers came to her door, and continued her quiet life in the small house above the harbor. But Perseus had grown now, and he stood between his mother and the king, tall and steady, with the calm patience of someone who had been raised by fishermen. Polydectes understood that as long as the young man remained on Seriphos, Danae would never be his. He did not threaten the boy openly. A king who killed a guest in his own hall would be cursed by the gods, and Polydectes was many things, but he was not foolish. Instead, he chose a different path. the path of cunning rulers everywhere. He announced a great feast, and let it be known that he was at last to take a noble bride from a far island, and that every man of standing on Seriphos must bring him a gift worthy of a wedding. Horses, he said, fine horses, each man must bring one. Perseus came to the feast with empty hands. He had no horses and no gold to buy them. He stood among the other guests in his simple cloak, with the smell of salt still in his hair. And when Polydectes turned his cold eyes upon him and asked what gift he had brought, Perseus, young and proud and unwilling to be shamed, spoke without thinking. He said that he would bring the king any gift the king named. Anything at all, he said. Even the head of the Gorgon Medusa. The hall fell silent. Polydectes smiled. He had been waiting a long time for those words. That night, after the feast had ended and the lamps had burned low, Perseus sat outside his mother's house and looked across the dark water and understood what he had done. The Gorgons lived at the very edge of the world. They had skin like beaten bronze and wings of gold, and snakes that hissed and writhed in place of hair. 2 of them were immortal. Only Medusa could be killed, and even Medusa could turn a man to stone with a single glance. No one who had gone seeking her had ever returned. Perseus sat in the dark for a long time, and the sea, which had once carried him here as a child, gave him no answer. But the gods had not forgotten the boy in the bronze chamber. Athena, gray-eyed and watchful, had her own quiet reasons to wish Medusa dead, and Hermes, swift and curious, had taken an interest in the young man with the quiet eyes. They came to him as he walked alone above the harbor the next morning, the goddess on his right and the god on his left, and they spoke to him in the easy way that immortals speak when they have decided to help. Athena unstrapped the bright shield from her shoulder and gave it to him, polished until it shone like still water. "Do not look at her," she said. "Look only at her reflection." Hermes laid into his hand a curved sword, sharper than any blade made by mortal smiths. Then they told him where to begin. He must first find the Graeae, the 3 gray sisters who lived in a cave at the foot of a cold mountain, and from them he must learn the way to the nymphs who guarded the rest of what he would need. The gray were old beyond counting. They had been born gray, with wrinkled hands and white hair, and between the 3 of them they shared only a single eye and a single tooth, which they passed back and forth as they spoke. They knew secrets that no one else remembered, but they would not give them up easily. Perseus traveled for many days. He walked through pine forests where the snow still lay in the shadows, and across cold rivers, and over passes where the wind sounded like distant voices. At last he came to the cave of the Graeae and stood quietly at the entrance and watched. He saw the 3 old sisters sitting on the stones, leaning close together, passing the eye from one wrinkled hand to another. He waited until the moment when the eye was in the air, between hands, when none of them could see, and then he stepped forward in silence and caught it gently in his palm. The sisters cried out. They reached for one another in the dark. Perseus spoke softly, so as not to frighten them more than he had to. He told them he meant no harm. He told them what he sought, and he told them that the eye would be returned the moment they answered his question. The Graeae argued among themselves in their thin, dry voices. Then, slowly, they told him the way to the garden of the nymphs, far in the west, where the road grew strange and the air began to taste of salt and silver. He set the eye carefully back into the oldest sister's hand and bowed and went on. The nymphs welcomed him gently, as if they had been expecting him. They lived in a quiet valley where the trees never lost their leaves, and they served him bread and clear water and asked him to sit. When he had rested, they brought out 3 gifts, which had been kept in their care for as long as anyone could remember. The first was a pair of winged sandals, light as feathers, that would carry him through the air. The second was a curved sack called the kibbesis, made to hold any burden, no matter how heavy or how dangerous. The third was a helmet of dark metal, the helm of Hades himself, which made its wearer invisible to mortal and immortal alike. Perseus thanked them and tied the sandals to his feet and felt them lift him gently from the ground. He folded the sack across his shoulder. He took the dark helm in his hand. Then, with Athena's shield on his arm and Hermes' sword at his belt, he rose into the air and turned westward, toward the place where the world ended. He flew for a long time. Below him the sea darkened from blue to wine to black, and the islands grew strange and small. The stars above him were not the stars he had learned from the old fisherman on Seriphos. At last he saw on a barren shore beneath him a quiet grove of stone. He came down softly and walked among the figures and saw that they were not statues at all. They were men. Each one had been turned to stone in the moment he had seen what he should not have seen. Some had their hands raised. Some had their mouths still open. Their faces were carved by no chisel, but by their own last sight. Beyond the grove, in a sheltered place among the rocks, the 3 Gorgons lay sleeping. Perseus put on the helm of Hades, and the world went still around him. He drew the shining shield from his arm and held it before his face like a mirror, and he walked backward, slowly, step by careful step, watching the polished surface, until he saw in it the sleeping shape of Medusa. Her snakes moved softly even in her sleep, coiling and uncoiling in the cold air. He raised the curved sword. He did not look. He struck once, cleanly, and the deed was done. From the place where her body lay, 2 strange births came into the world. A great winged horse, white as sea foam, sprang up into the air and beat its wings against the stars. And a warrior with a golden sword stepped forth and stood for a moment in silence. Perseus did not stay to watch them. He bent down, eyes still averted, and lifted the head of Medusa by its serpents and slipped it into the kibbesis, where it could harm no one. The 2 immortal sisters woke then and rose into the air with terrible cries. But Perseus, hidden by the dark helm, was already gone. He flew home by a long road. Along the way, he passed the coast of a kingdom where a young woman had been chained to a rock by the sea, dressed in white, waiting to be devoured by a creature sent in punishment for her mother's pride. Her name was Andromeda, and Perseus, hovering above her on his winged sandals, saw her and was lost. He flew down. He spoke to her. He turned and faced the dark shape rising from the water, and with the curved sword he ended it before it could reach her. Then he loosed her chains and carried her home to her father's palace and asked for her hand, and she became his wife. When at last he came back to Seriphos, it was evening, and the lamps along the harbor were being lit. He climbed the path to Polydectes' hall, with the kibbesis at his shoulder, and entered the great room where the king sat with his closest friends. Polydectes looked up, and his face changed. He had not expected to see the boy again. Perseus did not bow. He simply reached into the sack, turned his own face away, and lifted out the head of Medusa. The king and all his men were turned to stone where they sat, in the middle of their cups and their laughter, and the hall fell into a silence that lasted for a long time. Perseus took his mother and Andromeda away from that hall. He gave the throne of Seriphos to gentle Dictys, the fisherman who had once carried him up from the shore. Then, with his wife at his side, and the gifts of the gods returned to their keepers, he set his face at last toward the place he had never seen, but had always belonged to. He turned toward Argos, where an old king still lived in a high palace, and where the prophecy that had begun in a bronze chamber was waiting, patiently, for the last word to be spoken. Chapter 3. The Cradle of Serpents. The legacy of Perseus did not fade with the stone king of Seriphos. It flowed like a slow, deep river into the foundations of Thebes, waiting for the blood of gods to stir it once more. Years had passed since the Gorgon's head was set upon Athena's breastplate, and the world had grown quieter, its heroes settling into the heavy sleep of history. But on Olympus, the threads of fate were being pulled into a new and tighter knot, one that would center upon a queen named Alcmene. The air in the royal palace of Thebes felt thick and still on the night the story truly began, as if the stones themselves knew that the boundary between the mortal and the divine was about to be crossed in a way that would shake the heavens. The night of Heracles' conception was unlike any other in the memory of man, for Zeus, in his celestial restlessness, had ordered the sun not to rise for 3 full days. He descended to the palace in the guise of Alcmene's husband, Amphitryon, wrapping the world in a triple-length shroud of darkness and starlight. Outside, the birds remained silent in the trees, and the dew hung heavy and unmoving upon the grass, as time itself seemed to pool in the shadows of the bedchamber. The king of the gods lay with the mortal queen, his presence a weight of ancient fire and golden light that left a mark upon her womb, a divine spark that would one day ignite into the greatest hero the world would ever know. Hera, watching from her high throne of ivory and gold, felt the familiar sting of betrayal like a cold blade against her heart. She knew her husband's ways too well, and she saw the threat in the unborn child, a boy whose strength would one day rival her own son's. With a whispered command to the goddesses of childbirth, she sought to steal the boy's birthright before he could even draw his first breath. She delayed the arrival of Heracles while hurrying the birth of his cousin, Eurystheus, ensuring that the lesser man would wear the crown of Tyrants. The air in the birthing chamber grew frigid and stagnant as the divine struggle unfolded. A silent war of wills fought over the cries of a woman and the turning of the stars. The nursery in the palace of Thebes was lit by the soft, flickering glow of a single bronze oil lamp, its light dancing across the carved cedar beams of the ceiling. In the cradle lay 2 infants, twins of different fathers, Iphicles, the mortal son of a king, and Heracles, the child of the storm. They slept in the quiet peace of the innocent, unaware that a shadow was creeping across the threshold. Hera had sent her messengers, 2 massive serpents with scales as dark as the abyss and eyes that burned like embers in the gloom. They slithered over the cold marble floor, their scales rasping against the stone with a sound like dry parchment, their forked tongues tasting the air for the scent of divine blood. When the serpents reached the edge of the cradle, they reared up, their shadows stretching long and jagged against the nursery walls. Iphicles woke with a thin, terrified wail that echoed through the silent corridors of the palace, but Heracles did not cry. Instead, he opened his eyes, clear and steady as the morning sky, and reached out with hands that were already possessed of a man's strength. He grasped the serpents by their thick, muscular necks, his fingers sinking into their cold, dry scales as they coiled frantically around his tiny arms. There was no struggle, only a sudden, final silence as the life was choked out of the beasts, their heavy bodies falling limp over the edge of the wooden cradle. As the years unfolded, the boy grew into a youth of such immense proportions that he seemed to have been carved from the very mountains he wandered. He moved through the courtyards of Thebes with a restless, powerful grace, his footsteps leaving deep imprints in the marble dust of the practice floors. He was trained by the finest masters in Greece, in the art of the bow, the chariot, and the heavy grip of the wrestler. But there was a wildness in him that no tutor could fully contain. He walked beneath the hot Mediterranean sun, the sweat gleaming on his broad shoulders, carrying the weight of a divinity he did not yet understand. His heart a drumbeat that echoed the thrumming of the earth itself. Tragedy, however, followed the young hero as closely as his own shadow, for the fire of his blood was easily stirred into a destructive flame. During a lesson in the quiet, sun-drenched library of the palace, his music tutor, Linus, sought to correct the boy's heavy, clumsy fingering upon the lyre. In a sudden flash of frustration, Heracles struck out, the fragile wooden instrument shattering against the master's skull with a sound that ended the music forever. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of broken cedar and the cooling dust of the library. It was the first time the hero felt the terrible, unintended cost of his own strength, a realization that left him standing alone amidst the ruins of his own temper. Seeking to ground his restless spirit, Heracles settled for a time in the fertile plains of Boeotia, where he took the princess Megara as his wife. For a few brief, golden years, his life was defined by the domestic rhythms of a king. The scent of cedar wood burning in the hearth, the taste of honeyed wine, and the soft laughter of his children echoing through the halls. He walked his fields at dusk, his massive hands gentle, as he lifted his sons toward the rising moon. It was a fragile peace, a stolen season of humanity that almost allowed him to forget the divine enmity that still burned on Olympus, waiting for the perfect moment to tear his world asunder. The descent of Hera's madness was not a sudden storm, but a slow, shimmering distortion of the air that began at the edges of his vision. The familiar halls of his palace began to twist into the dark, cavernous shapes of a monster's lair, and the voices of his family turned into the hissing of serpents and the growls of lions. The shadows on the walls stretched into long, grasping claws, and the fire in the hearth turned a blood-red hue that seared his mind. Driven by a divine fever that left him blind to the truth, Heracles moved through the rooms with a predator's focus, his hands, once used for protection, now becoming instruments of an unspeakable, divine vengeance that he could not see. When the red veil finally lifted, it left behind a silence so profound it felt as though the world had stopped breathing. Heracles woke on the cold floor of his own hall, the morning light filtering through the high windows to reveal a landscape of absolute ruin. The blood on his hands was not that of a monster, but of his wife and sons, their bodies lying still in the pale dust of the palace. There were no words for the grief that followed, only a hollow, guttural roar that tore through the empty rooms, a sound of a man being broken from the inside out. He sat in the ashes of his life, the weight of his own strength, now a crushing, unbearable burden. He became a ghost in his own land, wandering the wild hills and the jagged coastlines, his eyes hollowed by a sorrow that no wine or song could drown. He finally sought the only path left to him, the road to Delphi, where the mountains met the sky in a shroud of perpetual mist. The path was steep and lonely, winding past ancient shrines and cold springs that tasted of iron and earth. He walked with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a man carrying a mountain on his back, his head bowed against the wind. The silence of the high peaks was his only companion as he approached the sacred precinct, seeking a way to wash the blood from a soul that felt permanently stained. Inside the temple of Apollo, the air was thick with the scent of burning laurel and the cold, damp breath of the earth rising from the chasm below. The Pythia sat upon her bronze tripod, Her eyes rolled back into her head as she inhaled the sacred vapors that granted her the god's vision. Her voice, when it came, was not human, but a rasping, rhythmic chant that seemed to echo from the stone walls themselves. She told the hero that his path to redemption lay in servitude to the man he despised most, King Eurystheus of Tiryns. He was to perform 12 tasks, 12 impossible labors that would either break his spirit or forge him into something immortal, a god among men. Heracles emerged from the temple into the cold, sharp light of the mountain morning, his heart a stone of resolve. He looked out over the valleys of Greece, the distance blurring into the wine-dark sea, and knew that his life as a man was over. He was now a servant of fate, a tool of the gods, destined to walk the edges of the world and face the nightmares that lurked in the dark. The road to Tiryns stretched before him, a long, winding path of dust and stone that would lead him to the lion's den and the serpent's swamp. He began to walk, his footsteps heavy and certain, as the first labor began to take shape in the shadows of the horizon. Chapter 4. The 12 Labors. The road to Tiryns was a path of salt and dust, winding beneath the shadow of massive limestone cliffs that seemed to lean over the traveler with a heavy, watchful weight. Heracles walked with the slow, rhythmic stride of a man whose destination was a prison, his eyes fixed on the towering walls of the citadel where King Eurystheus waited. The air carried the sharp, briny scent of the Argolic Gulf, mixed with the smell of wild thyme and sun-baked earth. As he approached the massive lion gate, the heavy bronze-shod doors creaked open, with a groan that felt like the beginning of a long, dark dream. He was a hero in name, but a servant in truth, surrendering his will to the whims of a king who feared his very presence. The first labor led him into the deep, sun-scorched valleys of Nemea, where the earth was cracked and the silence was broken only by the dry rasp of cicadas. He stood at the mouth of a twin-headed cave, the air within smelling of ancient blood and the heavy, musky scent of a predator that knew no fear. The Nemean lion emerged from the gloom, its golden hide shimmering like polished brass, a beast whose skin was a fortress that no arrow could pierce and no blade could cut. Heracles dropped his shattered club, the wood splintering against the creature's ribs, and stepped into the beast's reach. He felt the hot, rank breath against his neck as he locked his massive arms around its throat, the struggle a silent, desperate dance of muscle and bone in the shifting shadows of the cave. When the lion finally fell still, the silence of the valley returned, heavier than before. Heracles stood over the fallen beast, his hands trembling as he used the lion's own razor-sharp claw to flay the hide that had defied his steel. He draped the golden skin over his shoulders, the lion's head becoming a helmet that cast his face into a permanent predatory shadow. As he walked back toward Tiryns, the golden fur caught the dying light of the sun, making him appear like a creature of myth stepping out of the underworld. He was now a man armored in the impossible, his silhouette a testament to the first victory on a road that promised only more blood and labor. The second labor took him to the stagnant, mist-shrouded marshes of Lerna, where the water was the color of bruised plums, and the air was thick with the stench of rot. Beneath the surface of the swamp lurked the Hydra, a multi-headed serpent whose breath was a lethal poison, and whose blood was a dark, corrosive ink. As Heracles waded into the reeds, the creature rose, its 9 heads swaying like tall grass in a toxic wind. For every head he severed with his sword, 2 more erupted from the neck, hissing with a new and hungrier malice. The swamp became a landscape of fire and shadow, as his nephew Iolaus used a burning torch to sear the bleeding stumps, the smell of scorched flesh hanging heavy in the damp evening air. The third labor was a trial of patience and grace, a year-long pursuit through the dappled sunlight and deep green shadows of the Ceryneian forests. He was sent to capture the Ceryneian hind, a creature with hooves of bronze and antlers of solid gold, sacred to the goddess Artemis. Heracles did not hunt with the violence of a warrior, but with the quiet persistence of the wind. He tracked the animal through silent mountain passes and across rivers that flowed with the cold, clear melt of winter snows. He moved through the woods like a ghost, his footsteps barely disturbing the fallen needles of the pines, until at last he cornered the shimmering beast in a clearing of wild clover, the golden horns reflecting the soft light of a rising moon. Winter's bite defined the fourth labor, as Heracles climbed the jagged, ice-slicked flanks of Mount Erymanthus in pursuit of a monstrous boar. The air was so cold it felt like glass in his lungs, and the wind howled through the skeletal branches of the trees like a choir of the damned. He drove the beast into the deep, powdery drifts of the high peaks, the creature's heavy grunts echoing through the white silence as it struggled for breath. When the boar finally collapsed from exhaustion, Heracles hoisted the frozen, mud-caked mass onto his shoulders and carried it back to the sun-warmed plains of Tiryns. King Eurystheus, seeing the hero approach with the monster, dove into a bronze jar in terror, his muffled cries sounding from within the metal like a trapped bird. The fifth labor was a task of filth and humility, set in the sprawling, sun-bleached plains of Elis, where the Aegean stables had stood uncleaned for 30 years. The air was a thick, suffocating wall of waste, the smell so potent it seemed to cling to the very light of day. Heracles did not pick up a shovel. Instead, he stood by the banks of the Alpheus and Peneus rivers, the water rushing over the smooth stones with a cool, rhythmic chatter. With a strength that reshaped the earth itself, he dug deep trenches to redirect the current, watching as the powerful, blue-white water roared through the stables. The filth was swept away in a single cleansing flood, leaving the ground wet and barren beneath a sky that felt suddenly, miraculously clear. The sixth labor took him to the dark, reed-choked shores of Lake Stymphalus, where the sky was blotted out by a cloud of man-eating birds with feathers of razor-sharp bronze. They moved with a metallic clatter, their wings sounding like the clashing of 1,000 shields. Standing on the muddy bank, Heracles raised a pair of bronze crotala, rattles forged by Hephaestus, and clashed them together with a sound that tore through the stagnant air. As the birds rose in a panicked, glittering swarm, he drew his bow. The arrows dipped in the Hydra's poison, seeking them out one by one. The surface of the lake was soon covered in a carpet of bronze feathers and dark water, the silence returning to the marshes as the last of the predators vanished into the mist. The seventh labor sent him across the wine-dark sea to the island of Crete, where a massive bull, mad with sea salt and divine rage, was tearing through the olive groves. The air smelled of crushed leaves and the salt spray of the Mediterranean. Heracles met the beast in the center of a dusty plaza, the bull's horns hooked and dangerous, its eyes burning with a fevered, white light. He wrestled the creature into submission, his muscles straining against the animal's raw, primeval power until the bull's head was bowed in the dust. He led the tamed monster down to the harbor, the sound of the waves lapping against the stone piers, a steady, peaceful counterpoint to the bull's heavy, labored breathing as they prepared to sail for the mainland. Night and hunger defined the eighth labor, as Heracles traveled north to the cold, wind-swept plains of Thrace, to capture the man-eating mares of King and Diomedes. The horses were kept in a stable of iron, their teeth sharp as daggers and their eyes glowing with an unnatural, predatory hunger. The air was filled with the sound of snapping jaws and the rhythmic stamping of hooves against the cold stone floor. In the silver light of a winter moon, Heracles tamed the beasts not with kindness, but by feeding them the very master who had taught them to crave human flesh. As the mares grew docile, their madness receding with the dawn, he led them through the frosted grass, their breath rising in white plumes against the gray morning sky. The ninth labor took him to the distant, mysterious lands of the Amazons, where the air smelled of cedar smoke and the sound of whetstones on steel echoed through the camp of the warrior women. He came seeking the belt of Queen Hippolyta, a gift from Ares that shone with the dark luster of worked gold and hardened leather. The meeting was one of unexpected respect. The queen and the hero speaking in the soft light of a campfire as the stars turned overhead. But Hera, ever watchful, spread a rumor of betrayal, and the quiet night was shattered by the sudden clash of bronze and the cries of battle. Heracles fled the camp with the belt clutched in his hand, leaving behind a field of broken spears and the cold, stinging realization that even peace could be turned into a weapon. The 10th labor led him to the very edge of the known world, to the island of Erythea, where the sun sets in a crimson bruise across the horizon. He stood before the pillars he had raised at the gates of the ocean, the air heavy with the scent of salt and the sound of the Atlantic's deep, eternal roar. To claim the red cattle of Geryon, he had to face a giant with 3 bodies and a 2-headed hound that guarded the herd in the shadow of the cliffs. The battle was a slow, grinding struggle against a creature that seemed to have too many limbs and too much life. When Geryon finally fell, his 3 heads lolling in the dust, Heracles began the long journey home, driving the silent red cattle across the vast, lonely stretches of Europe. The 11th labor was a journey into the heart of a secret garden, a place of perpetual twilight where the Hesperides guarded the golden apples of the sun. The air was sweet with the scent of apple blossoms, and the heavy, humid breath of a dragon coiled around the tree's trunk. Heracles did not fight for the fruit. Instead, he sought out Atlas, the titan who stood at the world's end, holding the crushing weight of the heavens on his broad, weary shoulders. In a moment of quiet, terrifying exchange, Heracles took the burden, the stars and the void pressing down on his spine with a force that made his bones groan. He stood as a pillar of flesh and will, while Atlas retrieved the apples. The hero's mind focused only on the agonizing, rhythmic pulse of his own heart against the weight of the universe. The final labor was a descent into the absolute dark, a journey to the sunless realm of Hades to bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed hound of the dead. He walked the banks of the river Styx, the air cold and breathless, the only sound the soft, rhythmic splashing of Charon's oar in the black water. Hades, seated on his throne of ebony, gave his grim permission, provided the hero use no weapons against the beast. Heracles wrestled the hound in the shadow of the gates, the dog's 3 heads snapping at the air as the hero's arms wrapped around its thick, muscular neck. When he finally emerged into the blinding light of the upper world, the hound whining and cowering in the glare, the 12 labors were complete. The servant had become the master of his own fate, his redemption written in the dust of every land he had crossed. Chapter 5. The Roads to Athens. In the quiet coastal city of Troezen, where the air smelled of salt and drying nets, Theseus grew to manhood in the house of his mother, Aethra. He was a youth of steady eyes and broad shoulders, raised far from the intrigues of courts and the clamor of war. His world was one of sun-bleached stone and the rhythmic lull of the Saronic Gulf, a place of peace that seemed to cradle his restless spirit. Yet, Every day he looked toward a massive moss-covered boulder that sat at the edge of a sacred grove, a silent sentinel that held a secret left behind by a father he had never known. The rock was heavy with the weight of years, its surface worn smooth by the wind and the salt of the sea. The morning he finally moved the stone was filled with the sharp, clear light of an early Mediterranean spring. With a low, guttural grunt and a heave that made his muscles burn like banked embers, Theseus shifted the ancient mass, revealing a hollow filled with the scent of damp earth and old iron. Tucked within the shadows were a pair of sandals and a sword, its bronze blade dull but its hilt carved with the sigils of the Athenian kings. He felt the cold metal against his palm, a direct link to a lineage he was now ready to claim. His mother watched from the edge of the grove, her silhouette etched against the blue sky, as the boy of Trozen transformed into a prince of Athens. Choosing the land route to Athens was a decision born of a hero's quiet arrogance, for the road was a winding ribbon of dust infested with terrors that the world had learned to avoid. While the sea offered a swift and silver passage, Theseus turned his back on the harbor and set his feet upon the rugged path that hugged the cliffs. The air was dry, carrying the scent of wild rosemary and the distant, lonely call of mountain hawks. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who sought out the shadows, his hand resting easily on the hilt of his father's sword. Each step away from the familiar shores of his childhood was a step deeper into the jagged, dangerous reality of a land without law. The first trial met him in the form of Perseus, a massive man who stood at the center of the road, leaning on a bronze-shod club that looked like a fallen pillar. The air around the bandit smelled of unwashed wool and old grease, his eyes small and predatory beneath a heavy, matted brow. There were no words exchanged, only the heavy, rhythmic thud of the club as it struck the earth, sending tremors through the dust. Theseus moved with the grace of a leopard, his father's sword a flash of bronze in the afternoon sun. When the giant fell, the hero took up the bronze club, its weight a comforting, heavy anchor against his shoulder as he continued his journey through the wild. Further along the coast, where the pine trees leaned away from the salt spray of the cliffs, Theseus encountered Cenis, the pine bender. The bandit lived in a grove of tall, swaying trees that sighed with a constant, melancholy sound in the wind. Cenis would capture travelers and tie them between two bent pines, letting the tension of the wood tear them asunder. Theseus watched the trees sway, their needles a deep, dark green against the white limestone, before he turned the bandit's own cruel invention against him. The sound of the pines snapping back to their upright positions echoed through the grove, leaving behind a silence that was broken only by the steady, rhythmic wash of the waves against the rocks far below. At the narrow pass of the Cyronian rocks, the road shrunk to a thin ledge of stone suspended between the sky and the churning turquoise sea. Here, the bandit Chiron sat on a carved marble seat, forcing travelers to wash his feet before kicking them into the abyss, where a monstrous turtle waited in the foam. Theseus stood on the ledge, the wind tugging at his cloak, the smell of salt and old leather filling his senses. He did not kneel to the bandit. Instead, he seized the man by the ankles and cast him over the edge. The sight of the turtle rising from the dark water was a brief, terrifying flash of shell, and beak before the sea swallowed the secret of the pass once more. The final terror of the road was Procrustes, whose house stood in a lonely valley where the shadows grew long and cold before the sun had even set. He offered travelers a bed for the night, only to stretch or lop their limbs to fit the iron frame. The house smelled of stagnant air and old copper, the only sound the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the bed's heavy screws. Theseus stood in the dim lamplight of the chamber, his eyes fixed on the iron bed as he forced the giant to experience his own lethal hospitality. As he left the valley behind, the first lights of Athens appeared on the horizon, a cluster of glowing embers beneath the watchful height of the Acropolis. Athens was a city of white marble and red dust, its streets a labyrinth of artisans, merchants, and the heavy, humid breath of a capital. Theseus entered through the Dipylon gate, his presence a ripple of curiosity amidst the crowd, his bronze club and royal sword marking him as something more than a common wanderer. The palace of King Aegeus sat at the summit of the hill, its columns catching the last orange glow of the setting sun. Within its halls, the air was thick with the scent of expensive incense and the quiet, poisonous whispers of the sorceress Medea. She saw the boy as a threat to her own power, her eyes narrowing in the flickering torchlight as she prepared a cup of wine laced with the venom of aconite. The grand hall of the palace was a place of polished stone and heavy cedar doors, where King Aegeus sat on a throne of worn ivory, his face a map of age and grief. Medea stood beside him, her hands steady as she offered Theseus the golden cup, the wine within dark and shimmering like liquid garnet. Theseus raised the vessel to his lips, the scent of honey and almond barely masking the bitter tang of the poison. But as he tilted his head, the sword at his side caught the light of the braziers, the royal hilt gleaming with a sudden, sharp brilliance. Aegeus lunged forward, striking the cup from his son's hand, the wine spilling across the marble floor like a splash of fresh blood in the torchlight. The recognition was a moment of profound, wordless stillness as the old king looked into the eyes of the son he had hidden away eons ago. He felt the weight of the bronze sword in his own hands, once more a physical bridge across the decades of silence. Medea vanished into a cloud of dark, sulphurous smoke, leaving the palace behind as Theseus took his place beside the throne. But the joy of their reunion was shadowed by a heavy, recurring sorrow. The arrival of the black-sailed ship from Crete. Every 9 years, Athens was forced to send a tribute of 7 youths and 7 maidens to be devoured by the Minotaur, a debt of blood that hung over the city like a perpetual winter. The harbor of Perseus was a place of mourning as the tribute ship prepared to sail, its black sails unfurled like the wings of a predatory bird. Theseus stood on the deck, the wood of the rail bleached salt white by the sun, his eyes fixed on the weeping families gathered on the shore. He had volunteered to go, promising his father that if he returned victorious, he would replace the black sails with white ones of celebration. As the ship pulled away from the quay, the rhythmic splashing of the oars sounded like a funeral drum, and the white walls of Athens faded into a hazy, heat-distorted line on the horizon. The journey toward the labyrinth was a slow, swaying passage across a sea that felt vast and indifferent to their fate. Crete rose from the waves as a land of red clay and towering cypress trees, the palace of Knossos a sprawling hive of stone that seemed to pulse with the heavy, humid heat of the southern sun. King Minos watched from his balcony, his crown of gold and lapis lazuli reflecting the harsh glare of the afternoon. Within the palace, the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and the sound of the bull leapers in the courtyards below. Theseus moved through the corridors like a prisoner in a dream, the walls around him decorated with vibrant frescoes of blue dolphins and charging bulls. It was here, in the shadow of the great throne, that he first saw Ariadne, the princess whose eyes held the secret to his survival. In the secret, moonlit hours before the tribute was to enter the maze, Ariadne met Theseus in the shadow of an ancient olive tree, She gave him 2 gifts, a small, sharp blade of bronze and a ball of silken thread, fine as a spider's web, but strong as an oath. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine and the salt breath of the sea. She was the secret of the labyrinth. Her voice a soft, rhythmic thread in the darkness, telling him to tie the yarn to the lintel of the door and never let go. As he took the thread, he felt the weight of her trust, a fragile connection that would lead him through the absolute dark of the world's most famous prison. The labyrinth was a place of cold, damp stone and a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the light of the mind. Theseus stepped inside, the heavy bronze doors clanking shut behind him with a sound of finality. He tied the silken thread to the stone and began to walk, the wall beneath his fingers slick with moisture and ancient moss. The air smelled of stagnant water and the heavy, musky scent of a beast that had never known the sun. Every turn revealed another corridor, another choice, another dead end. The silence broken only by the rhythmic, distant echo of his own footsteps and the low, guttering sound of a breath that was too large to be human. At the heart of the maze, the air grew warm, and the smell of blood intensified, the floor littered with the bleached bones of those who had come before. There, in the center of a circular chamber, the Minotaur rose, a nightmare of twisted muscle, with the body of a man and the massive horned head of a bull. The beast let out a low, vibrating roar that shook the very foundations of the palace above. Theseus dropped the ball of thread and lunged, the bronze blade a flicker of light in the gloom. The struggle was a violent, wordless clash of man and monster, a collision of order and chaos in the narrow, stone-walled heart of the earth, until the Minotaur finally fell with a heavy final thud into the dust. The escape was a frantic, rhythmic pull along the silken thread, Theseus leading the terrified Athenian youths back through the twisting darkness to the surface. They emerged into the cool, pre-dawn air of Crete, the stars still bright above the cypresses. They fled to the harbor, the sound of their muffled footsteps lost in the rhythmic wash of the waves. Ariadne went with them, her hand in Theseus's as they sailed north toward the island of Naxos. But on that rocky shore, under the heavy indigo sky of a summer night, Theseus left her as she slept. The reasons are lost to the shifting sands of myth. A divine command, or a hero's fickle heart, leaving the princess to wake alone to a sea that had carried her life away. As the ship neared the coast of Attica, the joy of victory was eclipsed by a single catastrophic oversight. In his sorrow or his haste, Theseus had forgotten to change the black sails for white ones. From the high cliffs of Cape Sunion, King Aegeus watched the horizon, his eyes searching the wine-dark waves for a sign of hope. When he saw the black sails, the color of mourning and defeat, his heart broke within him. He did not wait for the ship to dock. He threw himself from the cliffs into the sea that would forever bear his name. Theseus arrived to a kingdom that was now his own. But it was a crown won in silence and salt, the white walls of Athens now a monument to a father who had died waiting for a sail that never changed. Chapter 6. The Fleece and the Curse. The winds that carried Theseus toward the throne of Athens did not stop at the city's white walls. They swept northward across the rugged peaks of Thessaly to the coastal kingdom of Iolcus. Here, the air was filled with the scent of pine resin and the rhythmic clanging of hammers from the shipyards. Jason, a prince who had grown to manhood in the wild, mountain-shadowed sanctuary of the centaur Chiron, returned to his birthplace with the slow, steady stride of a man reclaiming a lost life. He arrived at the city's bustling marketplace wearing only a single sandal, having lost the other in the swirling, muddy currents of a flooded river. The crowd parted in a hush as he moved, a lone figure of destiny appearing exactly as the ancient prophecies had warned the usurper king. King Peleus sat upon a throne of cold, polished marble, his heart a drumbeat of fear as he looked down at the one-sandaled stranger. The hall was filled with the smell of roasting meat and the heavy, stagnant air of a court built on treachery. To rid himself of the rightful heir, Peleus offered a challenge wrapped in the guise of a hero's honor. Jason was to sail to the edge of the world, to the dark, legendary land of Colchis, and bring back the Golden Fleece. It was a prize of molten light and ancient power, nailed to an oak tree in a sacred grove guarded by a dragon that never closed its eyes. Jason accepted, his voice calm and clear in the echoing hall, setting into motion a voyage that would bind the greatest heroes of Greece into a single storied brotherhood. The building of the Argo was a work of divine craftsmanship, the air in the shipyard thick with the smell of fresh-cut oak and the rhythmic rasp of the plane. Athena herself guided the builders, setting into the prow a piece of sacred timber from the whispering oaks of Dodona, a beam that possessed the haunting ability to speak in the voices of the gods. As the ship took shape, its hull a sleek curve of salt-bleached wood, the heroes began to arrive. Orpheus with his silver lyre, the winged sons of the north wind, and the mighty Heracles himself. They gathered on the shore in the soft light of a rising moon, their bronze shields stacked like the scales of a great sea beast, as the Argo tasted the salt water for the very first time. The journey eastward was a slow, swaying passage through lands of myth and shadow, where the sea seemed to remember the world's first morning. The most terrifying trial met them at the Symplegades, the clashing rocks that guarded the entrance to the Euxine Sea. These massive, jagged cliffs would slam together with a roar like a collapsing mountain, crushing any vessel caught in their path. The Argo sat in the swells, the air misted with the salt spray of the crashing stone, as Jason released a white dove to test the rhythm of the rocks. With a rhythmic shout from the rowers and the desperate, synchronized pull of 50 oars, the ship surged forward, the cliffs groaning as they closed just inches behind the stern, forever locking themselves into the earth. When they finally reached the shores of Colchis, the air felt heavy and metallic, smelling of iron and ancient sorcery. King Aegean, a son of the sun, received them in a palace of dark stone, where the walls shimmered with a restless, amber light. He demanded that Jason yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls with bronze hooves and plow a field with the teeth of a dragon. Jason stood in the center of the dusty arena, the bulls' breath a searing white heat that distorted the air, their bellows a low-frequency rumble that vibrated in his chest. He moved with a supernatural calmness, protected by the secret ointments of Medea, the king's daughter, whose heart had been turned toward the stranger by the silent, unseen arrows of the gods. The extraction of the Golden Fleece took place in the deep, indigo hours of the night, in a grove where the trees were draped in a perpetual silver mist. The fleece hung from the ancient oak like a fallen star, casting a warm, golden glow across the dark grass and the tangled roots. Coiled around the trunk was the dragon, its scales a dull, iridescent green, its eyes wide and unblinking in the gloom. Medea moved through the shadows like a wisp of smoke, her voice a soft, rhythmic chant as she sprinkled a potion of sleep into the air. The dragon's massive head finally touched the earth with a heavy, muffled thud, and Jason reached up, the wool feeling like soft, warm light against his fingers as he claimed the prize. The return journey was a frantic, salt-stained escape across the wine-dark waves, the Argo pursued by the vengeful fleet of King Aeetes. The triumph of the fleece was soon shadowed by the dark costs of Medea's magic, a series of betrayals and crimes that stained the gold with the color of blood. As the ship finally crested the horizon of Greece, the joy of the heroes was muted, the golden fleece reflecting a sun that felt colder than the one that had watched them depart. The voyage of the Argonauts had ended, but the weight of fate was already shifting its focus inland, toward the sun-bleached hills of Thebes, where a different and more intimate tragedy was beginning to stir in the silence of the mountains. In the rugged heights of Mount Cithaeron, where the wind whispers through the jagged limestone and the stunted pines, a shepherd once found an infant abandoned to the elements. The child's ankles had been pierced and bound with a leather thong, his small feet swollen and scarred by the cruelty of a father who feared a prophecy. The shepherd carried the boy down to the fertile valleys, the rhythmic sound of his footsteps on the rocky path the only heartbeat in the mountain silence. He delivered the child to the royal house of Corinth, where he was named Oedipus, the swollen-footed, and raised as a prince, unaware that his very existence was a direct challenge to the gods and the dark, inescapable gravity of his own blood. As a man, Oedipus stood at a lonely crossroads where 3 dusty tracks met in the shadow of a high cliff. The air was hot and still, smelling of sun-baked earth and the dry rustle of the surrounding scrub. A chariot approached from the opposite direction, the driver's voice a sharp, arrogant command for the young traveler to yield the way. In the sudden, violent flash of a prideful heart, words turned to blows, and Oedipus struck down the old man within the chariot, never knowing that the blood soaking into the white dust was that of his true father, King Laius. The silence that followed the struggle was absolute, a moment where the threads of fate were pulled tight, sealing a destiny that had been written before he was ever born. He continued toward the city of Thebes, which sat in the grip of a nightmare, the Sphinx. The creature was a haunting silhouette against the sky, with the body of a lion, the wings of a predatory bird, and the cold, beautiful face of a woman. She sat upon a high outcrop of stone, her voice a low, rhythmic riddle that had claimed the lives of all who failed to answer. Oedipus stood before her, the wind tugging at his travel-stained cloak, and spoke the truth of the riddle with a clarity that shattered the monster's power. As the Sphinx cast herself from the cliffs, the gates of Thebes swung open in a roar of celebration, welcoming the stranger as their deliverer and their new unwitting king. The kingship of Oedipus was a time of outward glory and inward rot, a golden age built upon a foundation of unspeakable secrets. He sat upon the throne of Cadmus, the crown heavy on his brow, and took the widowed Queen Jocasta as his wife, unaware that he was completing the very prophecy he had fled Corinth to avoid. For years, the city flourished, the air filled with the sounds of the marketplace and the smell of sacrificial smoke. But the gods are not easily cheated of their due, and a slow, creeping plague began to settle over the land. The crops withering in the fields and the livestock dying in the stalls, as the earth itself groaned under the weight of the unpunished blood at the crossroads. The revelation came not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, agonizing unraveling of the truth, thread by painful thread. In the cool, shadowed halls of the palace, the old stories of the mountain, the scarred feet, and the stranger at the crossroads finally converged into a single, terrifying vision. Jocasta, realizing the depth of the horror, retreated into the silence of her chamber, her final act one of desperate, terminal grief. Oedipus, confronted with the ruin of his own soul, took the golden brooches from her gown and plunged them into his own eyes, seeking a darkness deep enough to hide from the sun. The hall was filled with the sound of his weeping, a rhythmic, guttural grief that echoed the original tragedy of his birth. He left the city of Thebes as a broken wanderer, his royal robes replaced by the rags of a beggar, his only guide the small, steady hand of his daughter Antigone. They walked the dusty roads of Greece. The sound of his staff tapping against the stone, a rhythmic reminder of a man who had answered the riddle of the world, but failed to solve the mystery of himself. The heroic age was entering a time of darker, more complex shadows, where the line between the victor and the victim was beginning to blur into the gray mist of the past. As they disappeared into the hazy horizon, the world turned its gaze toward the east, where a golden apple was waiting to spark a fire that would burn for 10 long years. Chapter 7. The Apple and the Ships. The dust of Oedipus's footsteps had barely settled on the roads of Greece when the gods turned their eyes toward a celebration that would change the world forever. In the high, sun-drenched forests of Mount Pelion, the air was filled with the scent of wild jasmine and the rhythmic strumming of divine lyres. This was the wedding of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, the shimmering sea nymph who moved with the grace of the rising tides. Every god of Olympus had descended to the earth to feast at their table, their presence casting a radiant, golden light over the long tables of cedar and white cloth. It was a moment of rare, unclouded joy, a season where the boundary between heaven and earth seemed as thin as a veil of silk, and the future of mankind felt as bright as the morning sun. But the harmony of the feast was shattered by a guest who had not been invited to the table. Eris, the goddess of discord, appeared at the edge of the grove like a cold shadow creeping across a sunlit garden. Her eyes were dark and restless, reflecting a malice that was older than the mountains themselves, and her movements were silent as a whisper in the tall grass. Without a word, she cast a single golden apple into the center of the gathering, its surface polished to a brilliant, taunting shine. Inscribed upon the fruit were the words, "For the fairest," a phrase that hung in the air like a poisoned challenge. The music stopped, the laughter faded into a heavy, expectant silence, and the three most powerful goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, all reached for the prize, their hands hovering over the gold in the flickering torchlight. Paris sat on the slopes of Mount Ida, far from the intrigues of the city, watching his sheep move across the grass like slow drifting clouds. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the cold breath of the high peaks. He was a prince of Troy hidden in the guise of a shepherd, a boy of quiet beauty whose life was defined by the rhythmic chime of goat bells and the shifting patterns of the sun. The arrival of the goddesses was a sudden, blinding intrusion of the divine, their forms glowing with a radiance that made the daylight seem dim. They came to him in the absolute silence of the meadow, demanding a judgment that no mortal man was ever meant to make, their voices like a chorus of wind and stone. Hera stood first before the young prince, her presence a weight of ancient sovereignty that seemed to command the very air she breathed. She offered him the scepter of all Asia, a life defined by the rhythmic tread of great armies and the absolute, unquestioned power of kings. Athena followed, her eyes clear and gray as a winter dawn, promising him the gift of infinite wisdom and the strength to never lose a battle. But Aphrodite, the goddess of desire, moved with a grace that was as irresistible as the pull of the deep tide. She did not offer power or knowledge. She offered the love of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. As Paris reached for the golden apple and placed it in her hand, the wind on Mount Ida grew cold, carrying the first faint scent of wood smoke and the coming fire. In the city of Sparta, the palace of King Tyndareus was a place of white stone and heavy, cedar-shod gates where the scent of expensive oils and roasted meats filled the air. Helen moved through the halls like a vision of impossible light, her beauty a silent spark that had drawn the kings of Greece to her father's threshold. They came from every corner of the world, their bronze-hilted swords and silver-studded belts marking them as men of immense pride and power. To prevent a war for her hand, the king bound them all with a sacred, unbreakable oath. Whoever won Helen, the others would swear to defend the union against any who dared to violate it. The kings drank to the vow. The rhythmic clashing of their golden cups, a sound of brotherhood that would one day turn into a call for blood. Paris arrived in Sparta as a guest, his ship a sleek bird of white wood and purple sails that rested quietly in the harbor. He was welcomed into the palace of Menelaus, under the ancient laws of hospitality. The air between them filled with the rhythmic pouring of wine and the soft music of the lyre. But the promise of Aphrodite was a fire that could not be quenched by guest right or honor. In the deep indigo hours of the night, while the palace slept, Paris and Helen fled to the shore, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft sand. As the Trojan ship pulled away from the quay, the silence of the harbor was broken only by the rhythmic splash of the oars, carrying away the peace of the world in a single desperate flight. The news of the abduction spread across Greece like a wildfire, a call to war that shook the very foundations of the old kingdoms. From the rugged hills of Ithaca to the golden walls of Mycenae, the kings of the Oath began to gather, their bronze-prowed ships filling the harbors until the sea itself seemed to disappear beneath a forest of masts. At Aulis, the fleet sat in a heavy, unnatural stillness, the water a mirror of stagnant blue that refused to ripple with even the smallest breath of wind. 1,000 ships waited in the silence, the air smelling of salt, cedar, and the mounting frustration of 10,000 men. The flags hung limp against the masts, and the rhythmic sound of the tides against the hulls was a constant, taunting reminder of their powerlessness. At the edge of the harbor, where the white cliffs of Aulis met the stagnant sea, the seer Calchas spoke a truth that turned the blood of the kings to ice. He told Agamemnon that the winds would remain dead until a great sacrifice was made to appease the goddess Artemis, the life of the king's own daughter, Iphigenia. The air in the camp grew cold and still. The only sound, the low, rhythmic thrumming of the surf against the shore. Iphigenia was brought to the harbor under the pretense of marriage to Achilles. Her white bridal veil, a cruel contrast to the dark, sacrificial stone that waited at the center of the grove. The crowd was silent, a wall of bronze-armored men who watched as the king prepared to kill the very child he had sworn to protect. The moment of the sacrifice was a heartbeat of absolute terrifying stillness, the sun a pale, indifferent orb in the heavy sky. Iphigenia stood at the altar, the wind finally beginning to stir the hem of her gown as the first breath of a new storm gathered on the horizon. Agamemnon raised the blade, his hands trembling as he performed the duty of a king at the cost of a father's soul. Some say the goddess took the girl and left a deer in her place, while others whisper of a blood that stained the white stone and never truly washed away. As the blade fell, the wind suddenly roared through the harbor, filling the 1,000 black sails with a violent, hungry energy. The silence of Aulis was shattered by the rhythmic, thunderous shout of 1,000 men as the fleet finally turned its prows toward the east. The voyage toward Troy was a slow, swaying passage across a sea that seemed to be gathering its strength for a decade of sorrow. On the decks of the ships, the heroes of Greece stood in the salt spray, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun rose in a haze of red and gold. Achilles sat in the prow of his own vessel, his bronze armor catching the light like a fallen star, his mind a quiet storm of ambition and fate. Behind them, the shores of Greece faded into a thin, blue line, leaving them alone with the rhythmic splashing of the waves and the heavy, metallic scent of the armor. They were sailing toward a destiny that would consume them all, a war of 10 years that was already being written in the stars above the wine-dark sea. The approach to the Trojan coast was marked by a heavy, humid heat that seemed to cling to the white sails and the bronze shields of the warriors. As the first ships touched the sand, the silence of the beach was broken by the sharp, rhythmic cry of the Trojan scouts and the first flight of arrows that hissed through the air like angry serpents. Protesilaus was the first to leap ashore, his feet hitting the wet sand with a heavy thud, only to fall beneath a Trojan spear before he could draw his first breath. The war had begun not with a grand speech, but with the quiet terminal sound of a single body hitting the earth. The Greeks hauled their ships onto the sand, building a camp of wood and shadow that would become their home for the next 10 winters. Night fell over the plains of Troy, the air cooling as the fires of the Greek camp began to flicker across the dark expanse of the beach. In the distance, the towers of the city rose like jagged teeth against the moonlit sky, their stone walls ancient and unyielding. The sound of the sentries' footsteps on the battlements was a rhythmic, distant echo, a reminder that the city was awake and waiting. Between the camp and the walls, the earth was silent, a vast, open stage where the heroes of two worlds would soon meet in a struggle that would outlast the very stones of the city. As the first stars appeared over the Scamander River, the Greeks and the Trojans settled into a watchful, heavy peace, the war at Troy waiting for the dawn to break its long, first silence. Chapter 8. Beneath the Walls of Troy. The 10 years of siege had turned the shores of Troy into a world of wood, iron, and weary patience. The Greek camp, once a vibrant assembly of hopeful kings, was now a sprawling city of salt-bleached tents and rotting hulls, where the air smelled of roasting meat, pungent cedar smoke, and the heavy, constant damp of the sea. The ships that had once roared across the Aegean now sat deep in the sand, their timbers graying, and their ropes frayed by a decade of salt spray and sun. Every night, the rhythmic flickering of thousands of campfires along the beach mirrored the steady pulse of the stars, a vast, silent glowing that spoke of a war that had become as permanent as the tides. The 10th year began not with a clash of shields, but with the arrival of an old man bearing a golden staff. Chryses, a priest of Apollo, walked through the Greek camp with a slow, deliberate pace, his white robes dragging softly in the dust. He came to ransom his daughter, carrying a weight of treasure that shimmered in the morning light like a fallen cloud. But Agamemnon, his heart hardened by a decade of command, chose pride over piety, his voice a sharp, dismissive command that echoed through the quiet camp. The priest turned away, his footsteps silent on the sand, and as he reached the shoreline, he prayed to the sun god for a vengeance that would strike from the air without a single drop of blood. The response was a silent, lethal rain of invisible arrows that fell upon the Greeks in the humid hours of the dawn. The plague moved through the camp like a cold mist, starting with the dogs and the mules before turning its heavy, suffocating attention to the men. Every night, the shoreline was lit by the rhythmic, somber glow of funeral pyres, the smoke rising in thick, black spirals that blotted out the stars. The air was filled with the low, guttural chanting of the priests and the heavy, metallic scent of burning bronze. The Greeks sat in their tents, the sound of their labored, breathing a constant, fearful rhythm in the dark. as they waited for a god they could not see to finish his grim work. The quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon erupted in the center of the camp, a collision of two egos that shook the very foundations of the war. Agamemnon, forced to return the priest's daughter to stay the plague, demanded Briseis from Achilles as compensation for his loss. Achilles stood before the king, his hand white-knuckled on the hilt of his sword, his eyes burning with a cold, divine fury that made the air around him feel thin and sharp. He did not strike, but the words he spoke were more final than a blade. He swore to withdraw from the battle, leaving the Greeks to bleed into the dust without his strength. He turned and walked toward the sea, his heavy, rhythmic footsteps marking the end of the Greek alliance. Achilles sat on the shore, the foam of the wine-dark sea licking at his sandals as he whispered his grief to the waves. His mother, Thetis, rose from the silver depths like a wisp of mist, her touch cool as moonlight against his fevered brow. She promised to go to Zeus to tilt the balance of the war so that the Greeks would learn the true cost of insulting her son. The air around them was still and salt-heavy, the only sound the rhythmic wash of the tides against the rotting ships. Achilles remained in his tent, his myrmidons silent as statues, their bronze armor stacked in the shadows as the war moved on without the one man who could end it. From the high, limestone battlements of Troy, Hector looked out over the plain, his bronze helm catching the golden light of a setting sun. He was a man of quiet, heavy duty, his armor smelling of cedar oil and the sweat of a prince who carried the weight of a city on his shoulders. He watched the Greek camp, the smoke of their pyres, a distant, hazy smudge against the horizon, and felt the first cold breath of his own destiny. Behind him, the city of Troy hummed with the rhythmic, anxious sounds of life. The clatter of looms, the cries of children, and the soft, desperate prayers in the temples of Apollo. He was the shield of the city, a pillar of stone in a world of shifting sand. The tide of the war turned as the Trojans, led by Hector, finally breached the Greek walls and brought fire to the very ships that had carried them there. The air was filled with the roar of flames and the sharp, rhythmic clacking of bronze on bronze as the Greeks were driven back to the water's edge. The smell of burning pitch and scorched wood was everywhere, a thick black shroud that blotted out the midday sun. In the Greek camp, the cries of the dying were a constant, harrowing rhythm, a sound of a decade of pride finally collapsing under the weight of a Trojan spear. The ships were the only home they had left, and as the first hulls began to burn, the silence of defeat seemed to settle over the sand. Patroclus stood in the shadow of Achilles' tent, his eyes wet with the smoke of the burning ships and the grief of a man who could no longer watch his friends die in the dust. He begged Achilles for his armor, seeking to trick the Trojans into believing the greatest hero had returned to the field. Achilles, his heart a cold stone of pride, relented, his hands steady as he buckled the bronze plates over his companion's chest. The armor felt heavy and divine, the metal glowing with a light that seemed to come from within. As Patroclus lowered the horsehair-crested helm, his face vanished into the shadow of another man's legend, and he stepped out into the light with a rhythmic, clanking stride that echoed through the camp. The battle on the dusty plain was a chaotic, white-hot storm of motion and noise. Patroclus moved like a whirlwind of bronze, the Trojan lines breaking before him as they fled from the ghost of Achilles. The air was thick with the scent of blood and the heavy, rhythmic thud of falling bodies. But at the edge of the Scamander River, the divine trickery came to an end. Apollo struck the borrowed helm from his head, leaving Patroclus exposed and dazed in the blinding sun. Hector moved through the dust like a predator, his spear a flicker of light before it found its mark. The silence that followed his fall was absolute, a heartbeat where the entire war seemed to stop and watch as the boy in the stolen armor hit the earth. The news reached Achilles as he sat in the indigo shadows of his tent, the silence of the room suddenly shattered by a grief that was larger than any war. He did not speak. He howled, a sound of raw, primeval agony that echoed from the ships to the walls of the city. He tore at his hair and smeared his face with the gray ash of the hearth, his body shaking with a rhythmic, guttering sob. The air in the tent felt cold and airless, the golden light of the afternoon turning to a bruised, heavy purple. He was no longer a man of pride. He was a vessel of vengeance. His only purpose now, to hunt the man who had taken the light from his world. His mother brought him new armor, forged in the white-hot smithy of Hephaestus, the metal shimmering with a light that was not of this world. The shield was a masterpiece of divine art, carved with scenes of the entire world, the stars, the sea, the cities of peace, and the fields of war. As Achilles strapped the bronze plates to his limbs, they did not feel heavy. They felt like a part of his own skin, pulsing with a restless, kinetic energy. The shield caught the morning sun, reflecting a glare so bright it made the Trojans on the walls look away in terror. He stepped out onto the plain, his shadow stretching long and jagged toward the gates of the city, a man-god walking into the heart of the fire. The duel between Achilles and Hector was a slow, terrifying chase around the ancient walls of Troy. They moved like shadows across the red dust, the rhythmic sound of their bronze-shod feet, a constant, driving beat against the silence of the watchers above. Hector ran, not from cowardice, but from the sudden, chilling realization that he was facing the absolute end of his world. Achilles followed, his spear a steady line of death, his breath a cold, rhythmic hiss through his teeth. In the shadow of the Scaean gate, they finally stood face to face. The strike was swift, a flash of bronze that found the gap in Hector's throat, and as the Prince of Troy fell, the city behind him let out a cry that sounded like the breaking of stone. The desecration of Hector's body was a rhythmic, harrowing display of grief, turned to madness. Achilles tied the fallen prince to the back of his chariot and drove in wide, dusty circles around the walls, the body dragging behind through the red silt. The sound of the chariot wheels was a constant, grinding thrumming that drowned out the weeping of the Trojan women. For days, Achilles remained in his camp, his heart a hollow void, his hands never clean of the dust and blood. He was a man who had won everything and found that it tasted like ash. Sitting in the dark beside the body of his friend, while the body of his enemy lay exposed to the cold, indifferent stars. The war finally reached a moment of profound, wordless stillness when the old King Priam crept into Achilles' tent under the cover of night. He did not come with an army, but as a father, kneeling in the shadows to kiss the hands that had killed his sons. The air in the tent was thick with the scent of old wood and the heavy, humid breath of the sea. Achilles looked down at the old king. Seeing the face of his own father, and the ice in his heart finally began to melt. They wept together, two men broken by the same war, their rhythmic, shared grief a bridge across the blood-soaked plain. As the dawn broke, a truce was granted for the funeral of Hector, a brief season of peace where the world was silent, and the smoke of the Trojan pyre rose into a sky that was, for a moment, clear of fire. Chapter 9, The Long Way Home. The smoke of Troy was a fading smudge on the horizon, a ghost of a city drifting away into the indigo twilight of the Aegean. The Greek fleet, once a 1,000-strong forest of masts, was now a scattered collection of salt-worn ships. their hulls low in the water under the weight of spoils and shadows. The sea felt different now, no longer a highway to glory, but a vast, restless desert of brine and memory. On the decks, the heroes stood in the cold spray, their eyes searching the west for the first glimpse of the homes they had left 10 winters ago. The rhythmic splashing of the waves was the only sound in the vast, dark expanse, a constant reminder that the gods were not yet finished with the men who had dared to burn a city. In Mycenae, the Lion Gate stood silent under the heavy, heat-distorted air of a Peloponnesian afternoon, its massive stone lintel a monument to a power that had grown cold. Queen Clytemnestra waited in the shadowed portico, her hands steady as she smoothed the purple robes of her husband's homecoming. The air smelled of dry dust and the sweet, cloying scent of sacrificial lilies. For 10 years, her heart had been a banked fire of grief and vengeance for the daughter slain at Aulis. She watched the dust rise on the road from the harbor. The rhythmic clatter of chariot wheels, a sound she had practiced, hearing in the silence of her own bitter dreams. The King of Kings was returning to a palace that had become a tomb. Agamemnon stepped into his palace with the slow, heavy stride of a conqueror, the air thick with the scent of cedar and the quiet, heavy humidity of the interior. He was offered a path of purple cloths, a sea of royal dye that stained the marble floor like a trail of fresh blood. He felt the warmth of the hearth and the familiar, rhythmic pulse of the city around him, a homecoming that tasted of victory and salt. In the cool, dim light of the royal bath, the water was warm and fragrant with mountain herbs, a sanctuary for a body weary from a decade of bronze. But as the water lapped against the stone, the queen cast a net of fine, unbreakable mesh over him, the movement as swift and silent as a predator's strike. The screams of the prophetess Cassandra tore through the palace air, a rhythmic, harrowing series of warnings that fell on deaf ears in the sun-drenched courtyard. She saw the shadow of the axe before it fell, her vision a chaotic blur of blood and purple cloth, yet her curse was to be believed by no one. Inside the bath, the king struggled against the net, his muffled cries sounding like a drowning man in a shallow sea. Clytemnestra struck with the fury of a decade of loss, the rhythmic thud of the axe against the stone floor a final, terminal note in the song of the house of Atreus. The palace fell silent, the morning sun reflecting off the spilled wine and the cooling water as the reign of the High King ended in a crimson hush. Far to the west, Odysseus steered his ship into a world that had no maps, the air growing cold and the stars shifting into unfamiliar patterns. He had left the fires of Troy behind, but the wrath of Poseidon followed him like a rising tide. The first storm was a violent, rhythmic collision of wind and wave, the wooden hull groaning as it was hurled toward the edges of the known world. His men sat at the oars, their breath a synchronized, labored hiss in the dark, their eyes fixed on a horizon that offered only more salt and shadow. They were no longer soldiers of a great cause. They were wanderers in a landscape of monsters, their journey a slow, swaying descent into the mysteries of the deep. The island of the Cyclops rose from the sea as a place of jagged limestone and giant, unkept herds that moved through the mist like slow-moving hills. Odysseus stood in the shadow of a massive cave, the air smelling of raw sheep milk and the heavy, musky scent of a creature that knew no law. Polyphemus, the one-eyed giant, moved with a heavy, rhythmic thud that made the very earth tremble. In the indigo light of the evening, the struggle for survival was a game of wits played in the absolute dark. Odysseus, naming himself Nobody, blinded the giant with a sharpened stake of olive wood. The sound of the beast's roar, a terrifying, vibrating wall of noise that echoed through the mountain passes and out to the silent sea. The shores of Aegean were sweet with the scent of wild jasmine and the heavy, intoxicating aroma of roasting meats and strange herbs. Circe, the sorceress with the braided hair, lived in a palace of polished stone where the air was filled with the rhythmic humming of her loom. She moved with a grace that was both inviting and predatory, her voice a soft, melodic thread that could unravel a man's mind. Odysseus watched as his men were transformed into swine, their rhythmic grunts a harrowing echo of their human voices. For a year, he stayed in the shadow of her magic, the time passing in a slow, humid blur of pleasure and forgetfulness, while the Argo sat on the shore, its timbers drying and its sails turning to gray dust. To find the road home, Odysseus had to walk the edge of the world, where the sun never rises, and the air is thick with the cold, damp breath of the dead. He stood by the black waters of the river Acheron, the only sound the rhythmic splashing of the blood into the trench he had dug. The ghosts rose like wisps of smoke. Agamemnon with his hollow eyes. Achilles, who confessed that he would rather be a slave on earth than a king in Hades, and his own mother, her form as unreachable as a dream. It was a place of absolute, breathless silence, where the memories of the heroes were stripped of their glory and left as pale, shivering things in the dark. A mirror of the world that waited at the end of every voyage. The narrow strait between Scylla and Charybdis was a landscape of terror, the air misted by the salt spray of a whirlpool that drank the sea. Charybdis roared with a rhythmic, thunderous sucking of the tides, a black maw that could swallow a ship whole. Above, on the jagged cliffs, Scylla waited with her 6 long, serpentine necks, her yapping cries like the sound of newborn hounds in a storm. Odysseus stood at the helm, his heart a drumbeat of fear as he steered through the spray, watching as his last companions were plucked from the deck like berries from a bush. The ship emerged into the open sea alone, the silence that followed the monster's feast a heavy, crushing weight upon the salt-bleached wood. On the island of Ogygia, Calypso kept the hero in a paradise that felt like a prison. The air was perpetually warm, smelling of cedar and incense, and the sea was a mirror of perfect, stagnant blue. 7 years passed in a slow, rhythmic cycle of sun and moon, the nymph's song a constant, beautiful thread that sought to drown out the memory of home. Odysseus sat on the rocky shore every day, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his tears falling into the salt foam in a rhythmic, quiet grief. He turned down immortality for the sake of a rocky island and a wife who was growing old. A choice that proved the heroic age was ending not in fire, but in a profound human longing for the familiar. The return to Ithaca was a quiet, shadowed entry into a world that had forgotten his face. Odysseus arrived as a beggar, his royal skin weathered to the color of old leather, his eyes sharp and cautious in the gray morning light. The palace was a place of noise and greed, the air thick with the smell of wasted wine and the rhythmic, arrogant laughter of the suitors who sought his throne. Penelope sat at her loom in the high chamber, the sound of the shuttle, a constant, rhythmic beat as she wove and unwove the shroud for the dead. The silence of her room was a sanctuary of patience, a place where the memory of her husband was kept alive in the repetitive, nightly unraveling of a secret thread. The contest of the bow was a moment of terrifying, synchronized stillness in the great hall. The suitors struggled with the heavy, unyielding wood, their labored breathing a rhythmic, pathetic sound against the silence of the watchers. When the beggar took the bow, the air grew cold and thin. With a single rhythmic pull that made the ancient strings sing like a swallow, he sent the arrow through the 12 axe heads, the sound of the impact a series of sharp metallic notes. The slaughter that followed was swift and absolute. the hall filled with the clash of bronze and the cries of men who had mistaken a king for a ghost. The blood on the floor reflected the flickering light of the torches, a final cleansing of the house. As the heroes faded into the mist of legend, the world began to feel smaller, more silent, and more certain. The gods withdrew into the high clouds of Olympus, their voices becoming the distant rumble of thunder rather than the commands of kings. The marble temples remained, but the bronze-clad demigods no longer walked the dusty roads of the Peloponnese. The Age of Heroes was closing, giving way to the Age of Iron, where men would live shorter lives and fight wars for smaller causes. The memory of Troy, of the Labyrinth, and of the great labors became a song sung by firelight, a tapestry of myths that provided the only light in a world that was growing increasingly dark and quiet. Tonight, the journey ends at the edge of that ancient sea. The water continues to wash against the shore in a rhythmic, eternal lullaby, carrying the salt of the heroes' tears and the echoes of their final shouts. The palace fires have burned down to embers, and the looms are silent. You are safe in the quiet of the present. The deep-time memory of Greece settling around you like a warm, protective blanket. Let the images of the wine-dark sea and the white marble halls fade into a peaceful, dreamless drift. The cycle is complete, and the stars are the only watchers left. Thank you for joining us on this long journey through the heroic age. If these stories have brought you comfort, please consider liking and subscribing for more immersive paths into the past. Good night.